Thank you very much for the chance to speak here today, and I can see from the agenda that you've had a very busy week, and I appreciate the fact that you've come in at a reasonably early time in the morning on a very sunny day to hear what I have to say. I hope you've enjoyed the week. I think these events organised by the ICD are stimulating and thoughtful, and I'm sure in the course of the week some of the speakers have been exceptional and others have maybe been a little bit repetitive, but hopefully in the course of the week it's given you much food for thought. I want to talk about two things this morning, and it seemed appropriate this week, the General Assembly week at the United Nations here in New York, to address these issues. One being the new global goals for sustainable development, and the second being the issue of global governance, and relate them in some way to the importance of cultural diplomacy, which is what the ICD ultimately is all about. I think I was reflecting on this last night and what to say this morning, and I think for me, the new global goals for sustainable development that will be agreed, will be formally launched tomorrow at the UN General Assembly, and then agreed by all the leaders over the next few days. I think they might just possibly be the greatest exercise ever in cultural diplomacy in action. They arise from, and forgive me, those of you who already know a lot about this subject, forgive me if I repeat things you know already, but I want to progress through the story behind the goals, as well as where we might go from here. The Sustainable Development Goals build on the Millennium Development Goals. And the Millennium Development Goals were important of their time. They were agreed between 2000 and 2001. They were a serious attempt at the beginning of the 21st century to do something about the fact that we still had, at the end of the 20th century, extreme poverty in our world, far too many children, hundreds of millions dying before the age of 5, without the kind of what should be relatively easy access to vaccinations and health care that many of us in the developed world take for granted. The fact that hundreds of millions still had no access to clean water, the fact that in many countries maternity care was absent, and so on. These were really important issues to be tackled at the end of a 20th century when perhaps they should have been tackled many decades before. They also came at the end of a decade of civil war and conflict across the world, as the aftermath of the Berlin Wall coming down and the end of the Cold War led to all kinds of fraction and conflict in different continents. So the Millennium Development Goals were really important, but they were very basic. And they were designed, effectively, they talk about a group of people sitting in a room to draw up the Millennium Development Goals, but actually it was pretty much one guy on a bit of paper. And originally they had 7, they ended up with 8. But he had 7 at the end of the first discussion. And he walked along the corridor to the meeting where they were to be properly discussed by the ambassadors before they were presented to the heads of state. And somebody said, "Have you included climate?" And he went, "Oh, I forgot." And he went back. They went back and added climate as the 8th goal. And so, although they were important and they addressed urgent issues, they were designed by a small group of people. They were agreed here in New York rather than across the countries of the globe. There was not a shared process of participation and ownership that would lead to immediate action to implement them. And that's why, really, in the first 5 years after 2000, the progress to achieve those Millennium Development Goals was almost non-existent in most countries across the world. I was at an event last night organised by the Beyond 2015 campaign, the campaign that sought to achieve a more ambitious goals for the next 15 years. And it was hosted by the Indonesian government. And one of the things that was said there was that the Indonesian government only formally adopted the Millennium Development Goals in a National Development Plan in 2010, 10 years after the original goals were set out and agreed here in New York. And that was typical around the world. So although the Millennium Development Goals have led to huge progress, and the number of people in extreme poverty in our world today is half what it was 20 years ago. the improvements in maternity care and vaccination programs, in primary school education, where there's something like 85% access throughout the world now. These improvements would not have happened without some ambitious targets that the countries of the world united to agree and then to work towards. But they were never enough. They were never enough partly because of the process that agreed them in the first place. And that's where I think this reference to cultural diplomacy comes in, and why I say that I think the new goals that will be agreed this weekend have been the biggest exercise in cultural diplomacy that has ever taken place. It was agreed 5 years ago that that old process wasn't good enough. It was agreed 4 years ago to set up a new process that would lead to the new goals that are being agreed this week. And that process has been the biggest exercise in participation and partnership, I think, that the world has ever seen. Something like 50,000 people took part in a global survey to identify the things that mattered most to them. Right across the world, parliaments, governments, non-governmental organisations, faith groups, and others have been debating and discussing these goals and taking part in continental and regional meetings to try and come up with a framework that the world could agree by consensus and by acclamation here this weekend in New York, but that would also at the same time not be what we would call the lowest common denominator, not just be the things that everybody could easily agree upon, but would actually be ambitious and transformative as well. And I think it's only possible to have achieved that. I'll say a bit more about the detail in a second. To me, it's only possible to have achieved that by a process of listening and understanding. And for me, cultural diplomacy, if it is anything, is about listening and understanding the perspective of others. So I think this is really exciting this weekend. I think it's an incredible moment in the history of global governance, and potentially a very, very important moment in the development of a fairer, more prosperous, more equal, more just world. The global goals for sustainable development, as they're about to become known and hopefully become famous, that's one of the objectives of these next few weeks, to try and ensure that everybody in the world knows about these goals, because if everybody knows, then everybody can pressurise their governments to actually implement them. 17 goals, covering everything from education through health, the environment, disaster resilience, peace and justice, climate, and the critically important issue of the empowerment of and equality for women and girls. And these global goals are underpinned by 169, it seems a ridiculously high, maybe arbitrary number, 169, but 169 individual targets related to each of the goals that the intention is over the next 15 years to measure, and that's going to be a challenge in itself. And these goals, I think, have the potential to be truly transformative. Not just to improve basic services in places where those services don't exist, not just to rack up big numbers of new schools or new school places, big numbers of vaccinations or cuts in the deaths of children from avoidable diseases, not just big numbers in access to clean water or sanitation, not just improvements in women's representation at the local or the national level, and not just the improvements in accountability and data collection and transparency that can lead to better governance. But even more fundamentally than that, a genuine commitment to understanding that these goals will not be truly transformative for our world unless they reach the most marginalised people, the most marginalised communities, those who have been least impacted by the Millennium Development Goals. And that's why these goals are best described by leave no one behind. And that will be the catchphrase that you will hear, hopefully, over these next few days from global leaders. Leave no one behind is not about ensuring that the broad mass has access to these services and these opportunities and that justice and hopefully eventually closer to equality. But it's about ensuring that these goals transform the lives of those who live in the worst conditions, the most extreme poverty, the most danger or fear of violence or conflict, the most unjust, underrepresented, discriminated against communities, indigenous people, in some countries in the world, women and girls, in some countries in the world, those with disabilities or medical conditions that are frowned upon or ignored, and so on and so forth. These are to me, these are the priorities for these Sustainable Development Goals that will really change the world in a way that leaves no one behind. And that is what is meant by the phrase, leave no one behind. No goal met unless it is met for everybody. That makes these global goals the transformative, ambitious programme that the Millennium Development Goals were unable to achieve for the political reasons of that time. So I think this exercise, a huge exercise in cultural diplomacy, where people of different continents, of different races, different religions, people from different kinds of countries, rich and poor, secular, religious, and so on and so forth. These developed and developing. All of these countries, all of these regions, all of these continents coming together to agree these goals has been an exercise in communicating and dialogue and understanding each other, understanding where you're coming from and what needs to be done, and might just mark a turning point in the way that we do business in our world, and therefore a boost for the ideas of cultural diplomacy that you have been talking about this week. Because if we don't seek to understand each other better, then we will never resolve the conflicts that lead to this current mass migration from the Middle East and North Africa into Europe, or the people of northern Myanmar travelling across the seas to try and find new places to live in Malaysia or Indonesia or the Philippines and so many other parts of the world. This fleeing from terror and conflict, which leads to the greatest levels of suffering. So I think this is a really exciting moment, and I think this is an incredible agenda that's been set out. And it's going to need all of us to commit to it and to do something to ensure that it happens, because governments will meet with immediate priorities that will deflect their attention. Ministers and prime ministers and finance ministers in particular will always have day-to-day urgent pressures on them. And allocating resources, allocating time, having national plans to help the most marginalised, or to help people in other countries who need assistance and who need to be able to resources to stand on their own 2 feet. These priorities will never be the first on the table, but it will be global pressure from the next generation that will ensure, hopefully, that this generation in government pay real attention to these goals from day one next week, and that we actually start to see the progress that hopefully we all desire. I think arising out of this, if I can perhaps just switch to a related but similar topic. Arising out of this, it seems to me that it is just possible that global governance will never be the same again. That the agreement of these goals by this mass participatory process, an attempt to genuinely have a universal understanding of the problems faced by different peoples around the world, and to genuinely reach a consensus, a bottom-up consensus on the targets for the next 15 years, might just lead us to question the way that decisions are made up the road at the United Nations every week of the year. The idea that we can run a system of global governance in the 21st century based on the powers that were victorious in the Second World War in 1945 having a veto over decisions is so far now out of date and inappropriate that there is an urgent need for a global debate about changing that. And this whole issue, this whole perspective of cultural diplomacy, of understanding, of soft power, of listening, of dialogue, of participation, this whole approach has to surely underpin the system of global governance that we put in place at some stage to replace it. That is never going to be easy. Those who have the power just now will never give it up easily. But I think there is a case over these next few years to try and build a global movement that says the time has come to change this system. And I'll just offer a few thoughts on that. It seems to me that it is simply no longer possible to justify a system of global governance that, despite the rise of China and the massive importance of China to the global economy and to global relations today, to have a situation where China's at the top table but Japan is not, to have a situation where Russia's at the top table but India is not, to have a situation where the United Kingdom and France are at the top table but Germany is not, to have a situation where the United States is at the top table but the rest of North and South America is not, and to have a situation where no permanent member of that Security Council comes from the great continent of Africa. These are conditions of a bygone age, an age when there were still colonial imperial powers running half of the planet. When I was a young kid at primary school in the UK, we used to have maps on the wall that showed the British Empire in pink, and almost about 2/3 of the globe was pink on this map, belonged to us. It didn't really at that point, I'm not that old, but they were using old maps. But they still had, and this is a psychology that permeates the structure of the United Nations, and I think the time has come for radical change here. And I believe that the structure should both reflect the different parts of the world, but also it should encourage regional cooperation in different parts of the world. And I'll just throw this out for our interactive session, which I see is next on the agenda. It seems to me that if you had a Security Council, an inner decision-making body in the United Nations that was reflective of the regions of the world, the continents and the regions of the world, and that within those regions, either the regional body themselves or by rotation, the countries of that region represented that region on that inner body, then not only would you have a greater partnership approach to the way that the world is governed, but also that you would have a level of participation at the regional level, where countries in the neighbourhood would work together much more closely. And the best examples today of conflict prevention, of development, of opening up trade and bringing down barriers to economic development and to people moving around, are where that regional cooperation has taken place. Some of the regions of Africa, emerging regional cooperation in parts of Southeast Asia, emerging regional cooperation in some parts of Latin America, and of course the European Union when it works, which is not always. And these, it seems to me that the system of global governance that we have should encourage regional cooperation, because it's in the region, in the neighbourhood, that you are most likely to have the right peer pressure to ensure that good standards of governance are met, that development crosses borders and crosses countries and crosses peoples, and that the region then speaks with a voice at the global level and ensures that it is effectively represented. So I can see in the future a United Nations system that is based on that model, where the European states are represented by the European Union, where the Southeast Asian states are represented by ASEAN, where the African Union has 2 seats at the top table, and so on and so forth, where you have a genuine system of governance that is a genuine partnership, and where these ideas of cultural diplomacy can permeate every discussion and ensure that we have a greater understanding of where everybody in the world is coming from before major decisions are made, or in many cases up the road, are not made, as we see in Syria today. So with these thoughts, happy to open up for discussion. I think you're in New York. Those of you who have travelled to be here, those of you who live in New York are just generally lucky. And I'm so jealous. But those of you who've travelled to be here, you're here, I think, at a moment in history. I think these new global goals for sustainable development will transform hundreds of millions of lives, but they could also transform the way we look at the way we make decisions for our world in the 21st century. And you will look back on this week as a week when you were there, you were close to it, and hopefully in the short, medium and long term, you'll be part of the solution as well. Thank you very much.
So thank you. you very much, Jack. Don't sit down for too long, because now we would like to take questions and comments, and we finally have some time. Let's use this as an interactive discussion, you know, not only directly at Lord McConnell, but if there's other issues, he's someone who really has such tremendous experience. This is also a chance to maybe ask a question that you couldn't ask yesterday, etc. So this is our time, a special time with Lord Jack McConnell. As always, raise your hand, and then if you could briefly introduce yourself, so Lord McConnell knows which part of the world you're coming from, would be great. Ladies first, we'll start here, and then we'll go to the back.
Hello, everybody. My name is Maria Marta. I have a question from the point of view of development, of sustainable development. What's the phenomenon of separatism in the European Union? For instance, it was a debate with ICD in the House of Lords 2 years ago over Scotland, I think you were there. And now it's the same phenomenon with Catalonia in Spain. And the countries in the European Union, they meet forward the Millennium Goals and are developing countries. So what is this rush for the separatists? What is the pragmatism at the end for the citizens? And also the fact that not all the citizens are democratically represented, but they are excited or provoked. And all these countries are justified by past events in a historical or different economical projects. And also, it's not just Scotland or Catalonia. All Europe may be fractioned in hundreds of justifications. So I see it like a phenomenon. If you can speak about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for raising it. Very, very topical at the moment, of course, with the way that the European Union, or at least the states of the European Union, are not responding well to the current pressures. I think what you have here is a global phenomenon that is maybe most acute in Europe, because partly because of the nature of European democracies and their fairly advanced level of democratic development. But it's a phenomenon that is also seen here in America with the current selection of candidates for next year's presidential campaign, if I may say so. But also in other parts of the world too, where new people, new figures have come forward at election time and have won sometimes surprise results in elections. And that has happened in different parts of the world as well as in Europe. But certainly in Europe at the moment we have a set of circumstances where emotion is defeating evidence time after time after time in public opinion. People are reacting in an emotional way to what they see around them, and are choosing to listen to emotion and support candidates who express emotion rather than people who talk about evidence and the impact of decisions and their causes, genuine causes. And I think that's happening for two reasons. The first reason, I think, is that I think most individual citizens in the world, and I mean this pretty much everywhere, developed and developing countries and continents, most people understand that we live in a world today where the economy, to some extent our culture, our language, our communications are increasingly global. And that globalization is a fact and that you can't reverse. It's there. The speed of communications, the speed of transactions, the nature of trade, the global media and communications leading to a globalization of cultures and so on. All these factors are there. They are a reality in our lives, and we can't really change that. Unrealistic to try and think we can change it. But people want more control over their day-to-day lives. So they might accept that globalization is a reality, but they don't like the feeling of disempowerment. They don't like the feeling of losing control to these global forces. And their reaction to that is to support parties or individuals of a slightly more politically extreme nature on right and left who provide easy answers to that solution by looking inward to your own country and your own circumstances. And that is happening right across Europe. You know, if anybody had said, even 5 years ago, that a party of the extreme right would be at the top of the opinion polls in Sweden this month, as they are, then you would not have believed that that was possible. And you know, and probably the most symbolic social democratic nation on earth, party of the extreme right, is currently leading in the opinion polls. And but it's happening on both sides of the spectrum, and it's happening now in Northern Europe as well as Southern Europe. And I think it's maybe happening here in the United States, if we look at the presidential debates. Yeah. So I think that's one factor. I think the second factor is the crisis of leadership. And that those who in the past would have led these debates about the great changes, their successors are not providing the same vision and substance to try and counter this fear. And if you think back, again, just to relate this to Europe, but also United States and other parts of the world as well, there have been leaders at different times in the last 50, 60 years who have had a vision for what should happen, whether it was the creation of multilateral organizations, whether it was changing global economic relationships, whether it was dealing with the conflicts of the time, or the migrations of the time, or decolonization of empires, whatever, who were able to lead public opinion, shape public opinion, point a way ahead based on evidence and values. And that's missing today, I think, in our mainstream politics. So like a combination of a weakness in mainstream politics and emotion-beating evidence as a response of individual citizens to globalization and a feeling of disempowerment, I think are the two reasons for this. I don't have any great solutions to this, but I think those of us who are in the mainstream to some extent, I would put myself somewhere in that spectrum, need to be willing to tell the truth about the world as it is today, but also make the case for these great issues of dealing with conflict and poverty that lead to these mass migrations and all this feeling of threat. And I also think we need to make the case for sharing sovereignty. One of the problems in the European Union is that, I'll just finish on this point, the national leaders have been too willing to blame the European Union for unpopular decisions and revert to being national leaders, rather than make the case for, in our world today, if you're going to tackle climate, if you're going to tackle conflict, and you're going to tackle inequality and the global economic system and the challenges of globalization, then you have to have shared sovereignty and some sharing of power at the multinational level. And national leaders need to tell the truth about that. You cannot have solutions in one country anymore. And I think that's a big problem. So the one thing I would make a call for is that we have national leaders who actually make the case for sharing our sovereignty and solidarity internationally to deal with these major global challenges.
Okay, I think let's go to the back. You were waiting first, and then we'll come to the side, please.
I'm Fred Brex. I live in Canada. But I come from the Ivory Coast in West Africa.
Okay.
I'd like to ask a question about international culture. We see the world leaders, we talk about the need for more cooperation between North and South, between all the other people. But the thing that we see, we have more summits everywhere. We have a lot of summits, a lot of conferences, but sometimes I wonder if it is not sheer hypocrisy, because when we talk about, we need to cooperate more, but but in reality, the reality on the ground is that it seems that the world is becoming more and more polarized.
Mm-hmm.
That it is the might of the more powerful. The more powerful, I don't see them cooperating. Instead, I kind of see them imposing their views. So why always advocate for more cooperation, during conferences, symposium, big meetings every year we have meetings, but in the reality, we don't see that cooperation, we see, imposition of the will. Yeah, so can you explain that?
Yep.
Hypocrisy, or is it, am I saying wrong?
Yep.
That's what I said.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Good question. Absolutely. Great question. Having given a sort of pessimistic answer to the previous question, because I'm a bit pessimistic about Europe at the moment, can I give an optimistic answer to your question? I think I totally understand what you're saying about these summits sometimes appearing to be, or regularly appearing to be, those in positions of power coming together, maybe saying the right thing but not actually doing it afterwards, because that happens many times. But also, when there is a disagreement, the more powerful economic nations being able sometimes to stop decisions being made by everybody else. And I completely understand that. The one thing I would say, though, is that without the summit, you don't even have them at the table. And they can do what they like anyway. So I do think, although these international discussions are sometimes less fulfilling and less successful than we would want them to be, and less progressive than we would want them to be, and sometimes the promises are made that are not kept, and I've seen that many times over the years. For me, it is still better to have people at the table having that discussion, because you do edge in the right direction. So you do make some progress, even if it's only in words, or even if it's only in a compromise. But that is better than allowing the most powerful nations on earth to do whatever they want without having to have that discussion at all. So I think there is a purpose for these summits, and I think occasionally they do make progress. Whether that justifies all the summits, and it's certainly not good enough, but it's better than a free-for-all. Because if you had a complete free-for-all, then a small number of very powerful countries would just basically do whatever they wanted. And in particular, their companies would do whatever they wanted without any recourse to anybody else. The other thing I would say, to go back to my point about the regions, is that Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire, is a good example in that West African region of how countries coming together in a region can start to change that balance. My experience over the last few years has been that the global powers listen to what is said by ECOWAS on behalf of the West African states. The credibility that ECOWAS has built up, both in terms of economic action in the region, but also in terms of conflict prevention, trying to make sure that presidents stick to their 2 terms, and so on within the constitutions and that kind of thing. These sort of actions in that region, I think, have been, again, not perfect, but better than a free-for-all. And people around the world, if people give a good example of regional cooperation, one of the first examples that always comes up is ECOWAS. So not perfect, but an example of how countries coming together in a region, economically and politically, can make a bit of a difference. And ultimately, I think that's the way to create a better balance with the powerful states. I think it's very hard for small, independent countries, Ivory Coast or anybody else, to have anything like the power and the influence that the United States or Japan or China or Russia have. But I think regional organisations coming together and speaking with one voice can balance that power over the longer term. And that's why I think the regions are so important.
My name is Natalia, I'm from Russia, and I have a question about regional cooperation and about the future of global dialogue. So you have mentioned some regional unions. We have the same in our territory: Russia, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and also Armenia and Kyrgyzstan have joined. We have working supranational bodies, commission in Moscow, court in Minsk, and financial regulator in Astana. So they are working. The decisions that Commission accepts for example, in economics.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? Is that possible? That we will communicate Commission with European Commission, with Mercosur, with ASEAN and so on?
Yes, I think so. Absolutely. I think it's not only desirable. I think it's desirable, but I also think it's likely. I don't. I think the point that's been made by the gentleman at the back from the Ivory Coast in Canada. That this imbalance between small states and the large states can only be countered if small states, sometimes with a big state as part of the union, but if the states come together in groups, you're not going to change the economic balance between the United States and China and Japan. In fact, it's very hard for China and Japan to change the economic balance with the United States. It's even harder for everybody else to change the balance with the three of them. I do think that, economically, if we're going to get proper progress on trade, on economic cooperation, on some rules in financial services, maybe some action on transactions, these kind of issues, I think you need regional voices to be dealing with each other.
We think that in regional union, the legal economy should be has a chance to be heard,
Yeah.
and then with that united voice, they can
Yeah.
have a dialogue with other regionals.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Without that, you have two problems. One is that those individual countries are not big enough to take on the superpowers and to negotiate fairly with the superpowers. But the other problem is that their local, regional economy is completely dominated by the one big
That's true.
power in that region. So,
We'll try to balance that.
so people, in your area, people might say that Russia dominates this alliance, but Russia would be dominating the economy of the region anyway.
Yeah, that's true.
And it's only by trying to build an alliance and a union that you can, in some way, control that power.
We try to find that solution. We have for 3 representatives from each country.
Yeah.
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 We try to let everybody to have a voice and to speak and to express their interests.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. My name is Kim Gwen. I come from South Africa. I agree with your presentation. How we're going to now see this signing of and adoption of the SDGs. And I agree with your analysis that we really need to see the reform of the UN Security Council. I think it will be very sad if we don't see that accompanying the SDGs. Because for my view is we then have a new wine in an old wine skin, and it's not going to make the world anything better because we still have the old structures in place, still dictating what should be done. And so it will not really see the light of the day in terms of the implementation at the country or even at the regional levels. But I'm also very skeptical, to be very honest, with the regional model that is being proposed. Because with the current even emerging superpowers, especially you made indications to China, I think the problems there are that now you find different relationships that are emerging, and the countries are still able to bulldoze smaller countries. So even if, for example, we agree that this is what we will be doing in the region, in fact it happens. We've got several examples where the Southern African Customs Union have been negotiating, and then Botswana decides, no, we have been receiving a lot of support from the United States, or we've been receiving a lot of support from the UK, we are not going to be party to this. So you still have that because there's still so much bilateral relations amongst countries themselves. So I think if we are not careful, these bilaterals are likely to overshadow the good intentions that the SDGs may be carrying.
Yeah. I understand your reservations. The two things I would say, I think the reform of the Security Council is a huge challenge, because basically any of the 5 permanent members have a veto over that change. And to be frank, if countries are prepared to veto even statements about conflicts where hundreds of millions of people are dying and their homes and public services are getting blown away, then the chances of them not vetoing losing power are pretty slim. So I think there's an issue about the fact that the 5 states have the power to veto any change. And therefore it seems to me that the only way to build a movement for this change is from the bottom up. I don't think that academic papers or even negotiations in New York are going to make changes on this. In today's world, reputation matters. The United States doesn't always care about its reputation, but it does sometimes care about its reputation around the world. President Putin doesn't always care about his reputation, but he does sometimes care about his reputation around the world. The Chinese government, can put up the hatches like anybody else and build a wall, but they do care about the reputation around the world. And so I think, I kind of throw this out to your generation, really. I think this is if you like, my generation, I think, had 2 things to do. One was to get the Berlin Wall down and get the end of the Cold War, and the second thing was to build a global movement for development and deal with the global inequalities that we saw around us. I think the global challenge for your generation is to change this system up here, and to do it by get a global demand for change, that we need a better system of global governance. And so to some extent I throw that back, and one individual's not going to do it, but I think there needs to be an emerging movement around the world that says, particularly to the 5 superpowers on that Security Council, you've got to change this. You've got to have a plan. It may take 10 years to do. You've got to have a plan. You've got to be willing to give it up. Maybe initially voluntarily. There's a proposal, for example, from the French that the 5 superpowers, the 5 veto powers would agree on a voluntary basis never to use the veto in a situation where genocide or atrocities were being threatened. So they would never use the veto to protect their friends, basically, who were committing atrocities. Now that's a long way off, because at the moment only the French are committed to doing that. The UK is quite close to agreeing. The other 3 are nowhere near agreeing. But I think gradually it's maybe possible to try and build a movement towards this, and I think that's a challenge for you. And on your point about the regions and the bilateral donors, one of the reasons I think the SDGs are important is that particularly if we can make them famous, if we can get everybody talking about them, everybody knows about them, it does give governments, particularly small governments that are under pressure from donors, somebody to say, no, you were part of this decision on the SDGs, and we've built this national plan based on our SDGs, and we've got this regional arrangement based on those SDGs. So you cannot come in here as a bilateral donor and say that you will give us this money only for this other purpose. You agreed these SDGs, and you have to help us implement them. So I think it's possible that the SDGs, because they are different from the MDGs, might just give smaller countries the opportunity to stand up to the donors a bit better and force the donors to behave a bit better. But that's, again, I recognise a huge challenge.
I just think that what is happening in Europe, the emergence of
Yep.
the right-wing parties, I think it's similar also as between developing worlds in African states. What we see now is you also have got very strong populist movements that are coming, and they are challenging the current structures, global and even national. And they are really receiving a lot of support. And I think that, even if we can argue that the SDGs can be best implemented, I think we need to find a way of keeping governments accountable.
Yeah.
I think not very sure of the other parts of the world, but I know in most parts of Africa we don't really have accountable governments, and that is actually becoming more and more of a problem.
Yeah. Right, I'm going to take a few now because I'm dominating this with my answers. So why don't I take maybe 4 or 5 points and then I'll reply to kind of all of them in a group if that's okay.
My name's Josie. I'm an undergraduate student from England. I wanted to ask about the Sustainable Development Goals, whether breaking down the goals, so poverty, education, is detracting from the fact that a lot of them are quite interconnected. So if you tackle one, you're also looking for a solution for the other goals, whether breaking them down in that way is an efficient way of tackling the problems in the world at the moment, or whether we need to tackle them as interconnected instead of breaking them down like this.
Good question, very good question.
I'm Brad from the U.S., live in Florida. I was curious what your recommendations would be to reform the Security Council. Like, would you simply get rid of the veto powers? Would you get rid of the permanent members altogether? Or just completely restructure the entire council? I guess the concern would just be if you only have, one superpower sitting on the council, say just to China or just to Russia, just to U.S., then they can still, impose their power even without the veto. So I'm just curious what your recommendations would be there.
Okay, good. Judy, hand up.
Yes, I was wondering, you talk about ensuring the implementation of the SDGs, and I was wondering if there's any form of enforcement mechanism or supervision, or as you say, will only come from pressure from the local population to ensure that their local government actually implement the goals.
Yeah. Okay.
Actually, it's not a question. It's just coming from real experience. My name is Dalia Ali. I'm a gender specialist working with UNFPA, United Nations Population Fund, from Sudan. I used to work with UNDP, with UNFPA in Darfur, Kurdistan, and now with South Sudan, refugees involved between Sudan and South Sudan. This is my comment about the MPs you are mentioned about. Actually, we are facing a lot of problems with these MPs and SDGs. Because when we are coming on the reality, it is tied as because in Darfur, as example, there is 2.5 million people living in IDPs camp, and they're supposed to have livelihood intervention and so on and so on. Because of that, they have supposed to cut trees and so on and so on. This is against environment, and this is because of conflict and poverty and less of education. And when you are stick on these MDGs and sustainable development goals for UN, it is contradiction between both of them. My opinion before I joined this program here, I was expecting to hear from the UN delegation the day before yesterday at UN to talk about the coming MDGs 2013 and to involve the grassroots in the assessment and the need to meet the objective of that. I can't say that unfortunately I couldn't hear, but I was expected from the General Assembly and coming 2000 MDGs to involve all the actors from the ground, to give their ideas about what is suitable based on the ground executed from there. And actually, now I'm supporting South Sudan, is involved between South Sudan and South Sudan. And when we are coming to education, environment, child care safety, and all this, it is we are suffering because we are trying to support those people, and there is something we have to stick on it. This is the policies, roles, and that. And those policies are not not a Bible or Quran. It's made it by men, and I think we have to be consulted on that. We are very volunteering on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Andrea Caballero. I'm from Colombia. I just want to say one thing. When talking about that solidarity, that regional cooperation, I sometimes wonder where does it take? Where it is, when we have crises, big crises now, we have with one big now with Venezuela. I don't know if you know about it. So when we try to talk about it in UNASUR and in the OEA, the Organization of the American States, there were not enough votes to talk about it. So here is a big question: where is that solidarity? Where is that moment? We say, okay, Latin America needs to all be united and just to try to solve big crises. But because today they closed with Colombia, tomorrow it can be with other countries. Like they just take out the other people, all the immigrations and everything. So like that was my question, like where is that solidarity? Like if we're looking for global governance, like in just Latin America we don't see that.
Good point, yeah. Somebody else?
Rachel, actually my Chinese name is Chen Tongxia. I'm from China. I think this world need mutual contribution and mutual efforts to build a peaceful world. And actually China is rising and people can see that. And I think it is a good thing to see China is rising. But in some other countries, especially like the United States, I think this is a threat. I think the world needs a lot of voices. China, of course, is included. I think maybe because of ideology or some other reasons, we just have some misunderstanding. We need understanding. Because I'm in China and I was born in rural areas. I know how Chinese people actually getting better off, and from very poor situation to the better life. Like me, when I was very young, I think I was starved. I always feel hungry. I have really we don't eat a lot at that time, but gradually we have a lot of reforms in China, and we get better education. We get better social security. Actually, social security is covered all over the country, including rural areas. So, like my mother get a heart disease. If we do not get social security, my mother will suffer because it will cost a lot of money. But actually, when my mother go to hospital, majority of cost is covered. This is one example, just to indicate that China really get a lot of progress. And this time, my representation is about poverty. Actually, I did some investigation this year to 9 counties. I know Chinese government put a lot of effort to put poor people out of poverty. It is still a lot of work. This is domestic issues. I think that our Chinese government is doing its best to improve global image. Although others think that it may be threat, I don't think so. I think we just get some misunderstanding. We need more communication. Thank you.
That's very good. Thank you very much. I think that's very interesting for everybody.
Hi, I was going to ask a question. So I read this article in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago about, it was titled "A Case for Goliath." It made the argument that the international system is so chaotic that the idea of cooperation is far-fetched, and therefore we must resort, the article argues, to some kind of Goliath. Because for Goliath, there needs to be a very strong entity that could enforce or has the capacity to serve as some as an enforcer, if you will. I would like to hear your thought or your critique on that article from your perspective.
Okay, I'll try and deal with those various points, because I think there are some very strong themes come out of that. To go back to the theme of this whole week in this conference, I think understanding what is happening in China takes effort in the West, but it is effort that is well spent. And I think understanding the importance of it for the Chinese people is critical. And you're right, a lot of decision makers, particularly in the West, the Western developed countries, see China as a threat.
Yeah.
What we don't recognise enough is that the changes that have taken place in China over the last 30 years have taken hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and provided them with education, now with social security and so on. And I think that is, we need to remember just how underdeveloped China was 30 years ago. And the fact that that remains the number one priority of the Chinese government. Whatever we think of the system, you know, the Chinese government is trying to deal with a massive social problem in a way that, you know, currently has the consent of the people there. And so I think that's an example of, if I can say, cultural diplomacy. It's an example, in these global discussions, we need to understand where others are coming from and why they have their own priorities. And the same is true, I think, in some of the examples that the lady from Sudan mentioned at the back. I suppose that brings me back to the first question. If I can link all these together. Your point about the interconnectedness of the goals, and the other points about accountability and so on. I think what's really important now is that having agreed these sustainable development goals, and you know, 17 is a strange number, and there probably could have been 15 or 20 or 10 or 25, and you know, it may be that the wording might be different and so on and so forth. But there are 17, they do cover the major issues, and pulled together, they do provide a comprehensive approach to global sustainable development. The key thing now is to have national development plans that make those global goals relevant for the country concerned. And that is where the interconnectedness, the interdependence of these goals needs to happen. There needs to be a very quick move over this next 12 months to agree national development plans, to do that in a way that involves people and has populations participating in deciding the national priorities, because that's the best way to get accountability. If people are involved in the process, they know what the decisions are, and they can then ask the right questions about why those decisions have not been implemented. So I think this interconnectedness has to happen at the national level, and it has to be very transparent, and then it has to be measured. And there has to be a system of data collection that allows national populations in civic society to hold their own governments to account. I don't agree with the approach that says that the international community should hold governments to account. You cannot do that from the top down. You have to do it from the bottom up. And I think national plan, transparently agreed, and then transparently measured, is the best way to make progress on this and get the right priorities in each country. And not every country will get this right. In fact, probably every country will make mistakes, because governments make mistakes. That's just true. But it is more likely that more countries will make more of the right decisions if we do it in this way. That would be my approach. I think on the issue of global governance, I haven't seen the New York Times article, and I know that there's, whatever we do, it's not going to be perfect. But I do think if you had in answer to your question, I think if you had a UN Security Council that had, and it would probably need to be a compromise between some permanent members and some regional members, that a group of countries over a certain size in the world, because they would dominate the regions, and probably because they won't accept anything else, would have some kind of permanent seat but without a veto. I would say a permanent seat but not a veto. And then balanced off with perhaps maybe twice as many regional members covering all the smaller and medium-sized countries in regions. And now, again, that system's not going to be perfect because there are regional tensions. You know, there's huge tensions in Europe just now. There's huge tensions in South America, and there are difficulties in Africa. Yes, I mean the East African Economic Community is doing that integration work that is not working in the South African Development Community. But so there are some good examples, some bad examples. But I think the tensions in South America are largely political. Maybe not as historic or economic as maybe some other parts of the world, but there's a left-right tension to some extent, and that's very hard to overcome at the regional level. But I just think we have to try. I think this is not going to happen overnight, but if we could get there eventually, it would be better than the system we have just now. That would be my belief. And the only other thing I would really want to highlight, and I think this relates partly to the situation in Colombia, historically over the last 10, 20 years, situations in Sudan and a number of other places, is I think one of the biggest changes in detail in these global goals is the fact that they have a global goal 16, which is about peace building and justice and institutions. When the Millennium Development Goals were agreed, one of the reasons that they only covered education and health and clean water and so on was because at that time it was impossible to get the United Nations to agree anything that was more difficult. It was relatively easy to get people to agree to improve education. Getting them to agree that they could intervene more in conflicts and try and help avoid conflicts or deal with some of the underlying problems of governance and corruption or discrimination or whatever at a national level, was a much more challenging call. But Global Goal 16, which you should all carry around with you because it's there. It talks about peace building and justice and institutions that are fair to everybody and so on. And if we can get an international momentum behind that global goal, then I think the potential to avoid conflict and to create genuine justice for people and give them a voice is massive. And that's, to me, the fact that has been agreed for 2 years now. That was first written 2 years ago. And every single time there's been a summit, go back to the summits issue at the back there, every time there's been a summit, people have anticipated that the leaders would take it out, that somebody somewhere would object, like Egypt or somebody would object, and it would all come out. South Africa was one of the countries, I think, at one point that was objecting. But the majority have clung on to it, and it's still there. So there's a global commitment to peace building, to justice, to institutions, to fairness for all. And I think that's a powerful move forward and one that we can maybe hang on to. And I suspect that's me out of time. I'll pass it over. Thank you very much.